Be agreed to. Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as we heard from the Minister, the exclusive economic zone extends from 12 nautical miles out to 200 nautical miles, and the continental shelf, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, extends to about an area of 1.7 million square kilometres around the New Zealand coastline. It's about 20 times New Zealand's land area, and it contains, as we know, some of the wildest seas and marine conditions in the world. Now, over the last 3 years, we've seen an absolute failure on the part of this government to regulate the New Zealand exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. Well, we hear a cry from the benches opposite that nothing was done by the Labour government. The continental shelf was only confirmed as far as its extent was concerned in 2008. So the Minister needs to get his facts right before he shouts abuse across the chamber. The reality is this government's had 3 years at a time at which they have rapidly and massively expanded marine exploration activity, including offshore drilling, and nothing has been done, nothing whatsoever, to provide any sort of protections to the marine environment. So I don't want to hear too many pious words from the Minister about the so-called blue-green agenda and its triumphs. We're going to say a little more about that so-called agenda a little later. But let's just be very clear for the record. For the past 3 years, there's been no adequate oversight of the safety of offshore drilling, despite its massive expansion. No requirement for consultation with affected communities, as Te Whanau Apanui would tell the Minister for Energy if she actually fronted up to one of their meetings rather than hiding from them. And no adequate monitoring of the activity that actually has been undertaken over this time. Now, we're lucky, sir, we're just lucky, given the wild seas, given the difficult marine environments, and given the lack of oversight and safety conditions, that we haven't had a problem. I'm glad we haven't had a problem, but it is a matter of luck. It's not a matter of regulation, it's not a matter of oversight. Let's not kid ourselves. Nothing that this government has done, as it's overseen that massive expansion of drilling activity offshore, has had the slightest concern for offshore safety or for the environmental considerations that ought to have been taken into account. Now, sir, worse than that though, worse than the fact that it's taken the Minister all of his term in office as Minister for the Environment to finally get around to regulating the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf, despite having promised that it would be a priority for him. He said time and time again on the record that his new Environmental Protection Authority would have the task as a matter of priority of this job of regulating the exclusive economic zone. It's taken until the end of his tenure in office to be able to do anything about it. And what is he doing? He's not passing legislation. He's not proposing to the House that we take urgent action to remedy the scandalous situation that I've outlined. He's introducing a bill that has a prospective passage date of 1 July next year. So at the best course of action, if the government manages to get re-elected, if the select committee process doesn't take longer than anticipated, then on the very, very best course of action available, this bill might become law in about 10 months' time. So not only we would have had 3 long years of inaction, you can add a good part of a year to that before the Minister was able to actually do anything in the legislative field to remedy the lack of any standards in our offshore drilling industry around environmental safety. And if that wasn't bad enough, let's have a look at what the bill does. The Minister said, we don't think we should apply the RMA standards to our exclusive economic zone and our continental shelf. But let's have a look at what the bill actually does. It says that it seeks a balance between the protection of the environment and economic development in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. It's the minister's rhetoric continuing. He pretends to be a blue-green, but there's nothing green about his agenda. He pretends that there's this balancing act that needs to go on between our economy and our environment, whereas those who've actually thought about these questions know that it's exactly the same question, just on two different sides of the coin. And to pretend that you can only have as much environmental protection as your economic development priorities will allow you is the fallacy that lies at the heart of that minister's so-called blue-green agenda. The legislation itself is deficient because of the test that I've just mentioned, the so-called balancing test. It would be much better, even if the minister wouldn't apply RMA standards, to look at the sort of exercise that the RMA requires to be carried out when assessing any sort of activity. And this is what EDS actually asked the minister to do. He should be very careful before he claims their support. Because what the RMA does is it calls for the promotion of the sustainable management of natural and physical resources. The minister asks, what's Labor's policy? Well, that's our policy, Minister. The sustainable management of natural and physical resources in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. What's wrong with applying that settled test, that well-known legal test, to what ought to happen between 12 miles out and the end of the continental shelf? That's the question that has to be asked, instead of introducing this developer's charter by stealth that will actually simply lead to the economic... Well, I'll tell the minister what's about stealth in a moment, but let's not be under any illusions that all this bill will do is act as a new National Development Act, just like in the Muldoon days, for offshore drilling activity, and that will be this Minister for the Environment's legacy. What's stealthy about the legislation is this. The standards that it is to set into place are all to be developed by regulation, by the Minister himself. So we don't know what sort of environmental protections, if any, are going to be enjoyed under this legislation. We don't know the substance of the sort of protections that are intended for the EEZ and for the continental shelf, sir, because guess what? The Minister gets to make them up under this legislation. It's just a repeat of what we saw with the EPA legislation earlier in the year. Grand promises, great rhetoric about the blue-green agenda, and then we see the tawdry reality of what actually is going to occur. A weak legislative framework, no proper guiding principles, no following of settled law, and then it's all up to the Minister to fill in the detail when it suits him. Well, Minister, it's not good enough. It's not the sort of protection that most New Zealanders want to see for the exclusive economic zone and for the continental shelf. And it will be on your head, Minister, if we are unlucky enough to experience difficulties in offshore drilling or exploration activity in the interim, because you, Minister, have tarried for the best part of 3 years now, and it will be the best part of another year before we see any sort of legislation on the books. Even then it will be inadequate, and it will be up to you to decide how to fill in the detail of the legislation by regulation. This, sir, is not environmental legislation. It's a developer's charter. It's an exercise in cynicism because it involves introduction and first reading with 8 days of this Parliament left to sit, no time to debate it further than what we have today, and it can't possibly become law until the middle of 2012 at the earliest, sir. This is an attempt by the Minister and the Government to look as if they're doing something, but it's just an exercise in cynicism, and Labor will not support this sort of duplicity in any way.
Mickey Wagner.